Hi, my name's James Douglas. I'm an associate professor of marine science in the water school at Florida Gulf Coast University, and I'm going to talk to you today about ponds and their relationship to water quality. Talk title is Straight Talk about HOA Ponds and Landscaping, and we're going to see the difference between a poorly managed pond, which contributes to pollution problems, and a well-managed pond, which can help solve our pollution problems. So, one of the myths that I'm going to be addressing today is the idea that the landscaping and lake management contractors hired by HOAs are environmental experts that really have our best interest and the best interest of the environment at heart. The reality is different. The reality is that these contractors are really giving us what we ask for. If we ask for something that looks neat and tidy but isn't good for the environment, that's exactly what they'll give us, and they'll use harmful chemical methods to give it to us. Also, the contractors tend to favor high maintenance methods for the ponds that require us to hire them repeatedly and have them come back over and over again. So the contractors might try to sell us on sort of a chemical addiction program for our ponds, but there are much more sustainable and environmentally friendly methods that we could be using. So I'm going to give a couple of background concepts that are really important for understanding this pond issue and how we should manage the ponds. Most important background concept is the idea of a watershed. A watershed is a concept that is demonstrated in this diagram here. And the idea is that all the surface of the land is a catchment for rain. When rain falls on this land, which we can simulate with a little bit of rainfall here, wherever it falls on the land, it's eventually going to flow into the streams, rivers, and the ocean. And as it flows downhill, it's going to pick up the dirt and pollutants from the land and deliver them to the receiving water body, which may be your neighborhood pond, it may be a stream or a ditch, and eventually all those waters flow to the sea. So even if the pollution is being produced in a neighborhood far from the sea, it's eventually flowing into the lakes and ponds of that neighborhood and making its way to the sea. So wherever you are on land, your pollution problem is eventually making its way through the water to the ocean. And that's what we learn from the watershed concept. So when I talk about pollution, I'm talking about substances that humans put into the environment that have harmful effects. Those harmful effects can be hurting, killing plants and animals, hurting humans, interfering with human activities like closing off waters that were formerly available to us to fish or swim in that now we can't use because they're polluted. And they can also be considered reduced ecosystem functions, meaning that the nature becomes less productive, less able to provide us the clean water and food and air to breathe and the other things that nature provides. So any substance that we put into the environment that has one of those harmful effects is a pollutant. And the key pollutant to think about for ponds in our landscape is nutrient pollution. Nutrient pollution is a funny kind of pollution because nutrients are chemicals that are needed for all life. They're good in the right context, but in an excessive abundance, they cause harmful effects. Nitrogen and phosphorus are the two chemicals that are the most major nutrients, and usually when we're talking about nutrient pollution, we're talking about nitrogen and phosphorus pollution. When there's an excessive abundance of nitrogen and phosphorus, they cause an excessive growth of algae and weeds, and this plant and algae overgrowth is called eutrophication, and it has harmful effects. To explain eutrophication, I like to use an analogy with food and overeating. Food is something that we all need so that we don't starve, but if we have too much food, we end up with health problems like the person in this picture here. And the same thing with the environment and the chemical nutrients that get released into the environment. A little bit of nutrients such as are naturally found in the environment allow plants and algae to grow, but an excessive amount of these nitrogen and phosphorus nutrients causes an excessive growth of algae like you see in this very polluted system. So nutrients come from many sources. Synthetic fertilizers where we're mining phosphorus from the ground and creating phosphorus fertilizers in factories, where we're extracting nitrogen from the air and turning it into fertilizer forms of nitrogen. Making fertilizers, that is one of our man-made sources of nutrients, and we apply those to our lawns, golf courses, farms. Another source of nutrients is from our wastes. The food that we eat, when it's digested and rots in the sewer, it turns into chemical nutrients which can be released to the environment. And then the third source of nutrients is a little bit different. It's a destruction of the features of the environment that normally pull the nutrients out of the environment. So not only are we adding too many nutrients, we're destroying the features of the environment that were able to absorb those nutrients. So we're adding too much in and we're crippling the environment's ability to remove the nutrients. So plants are a key nutrient remover, and I want to explain the relationship of plants to nutrients here. Plants absorb nutrients through their roots and leaves if they're water plants, and they sequester those nutrients in their bodies as they grow. So plants fill up with nutrients and grow, and it hangs on to the nutrients and keeps the nutrients from being loose in the water. When the plants die and rot, the nutrients can be buried, or the nutrients can be released back into the system, and you have sort of a cycle of growth and decomposition with the nutrients moving between different parts of the system as the cycle goes on. Plant roots can also do something special where they can sort of neutralize the nutrients into forms that are less harmful, and water plants are particularly good at taking nutrients, at least temporarily, out of the system by this special microbial interaction that happens within the roots of water plants especially. All right, so getting to the pond issue. If you live in Southwest Florida or many other places in the country, you've probably noticed that your neighborhood and other neighborhoods are full of these small lakes. And these ponds are a universal feature of our environment now, but they're a man-made feature. And you might wonder, why do we have all these ponds? Well, it turns out, in Florida anyway, the ponds have been required by law since the 1980s. And there's two purposes that they are intended to serve, two main purposes. Number one is to reduce flooding risk. And number two is to filter out pollution, particularly nutrient pollution. So basically, the ponds are intended to do what the forests and wetlands did before the land was developed, to control flooding and filter out pollution. So other benefits of ponds, they can also provide a habitat for wildlife like the snowy egret. They can provide fishing opportunities. This is a largemouth bass, which is found in ponds. They increase property values, and they can have some aesthetic benefits because they're beautiful. But we shouldn't get too hung up on the pond aesthetics, because if we're prioritizing the looks of the pond, we might manage them in ways that cripple their ability to actually control flooding and actually prevent pollution. So let me say more about the flooding control aspect of these ponds. The reason we need flooding control is because development of the land creates all of these impervious surfaces, rooftops, roads, parking lots, areas where rain can't soak into the ground. And this creates more runoff, more water sweeping over the land, which picks up pollution and gouges away the land and causes other harmful effects. And then that runoff, if we have these ponds, gets captured in the ponds instead of flooding and causing a nuisance. And the ponds sort of can absorb a certain amount of runoff and then slowly release it later. And that allows us to deal with the problem more effectively.
Got it.
All right. So here's how they work. First, I want to show you how water flows through a natural landscape. When it rains on a natural landscape, the water is mostly caught by the vegetation, it seeps into wetlands, and all the plants in this system retain and recycle the nutrients. So the amount of nutrients that get into the waterways is relatively low. Mm-hmm. When you have the other thing that happens with all of this water lingering on the land and wetlands is that it can enter the groundwater and then slowly seep into the stream. and this allows the stream flow to be sort of steady even if the rain is coming and going. All right, so in a developed landscape, we have introduced all these impervious surfaces, rooftops and roads, and we've eliminated a lot of the vegetation. So now when it rains, we get a lot of runoff, and that runoff can cause flooding and erosion. In this uncontrolled runoff also carries a lot of pollutants into the waterways. So modifying the developed landscape with these artificial ponds can help with this problem. So one type of pond is called a dry detention pond. It's called dry because it normally doesn't have water in it. When it rains though, the water runs off into the pond fills up temporarily, and then it gradually drains into the stream, ditch, or canal. And some of the water that fills into the pond soaks into the ground. So you're sort of artificially recreating part of the function of the wetland. The dry detention ponds don't work so well for absorbing the nutrients though, which is why we have this other type of retention pond called a wet retention pond, which has some water in it all the time. And then when it rains, it just fills up a little bit higher, and the excess pours off into the stream, ditch, or canal.
It's like a natural sump pump.
Yes, yeah. So that's how they work for controlling flooding. But for filtering out pollution, that's more dependent on how the ponds are managed. In particular, how we manage the plants around the ponds. So one of the problems that we are experiencing now in Florida is that the ponds aren't removing pollution like they should because we're not managing them well. So this is what a pond should look like. If we're managing it well, it's going to look a lot like a natural wetland, meaning that it has plants growing in it, and the edges are lined with plants, which they call littoral vegetation. That's the plants that are in the water, and riparian vegetation, those are the plants that are along the bank. They catch and filter the runoff even before it gets into the pond, and their plant roots are good for absorbing and neutralizing the pollution. They also provide a great habitat for wildlife. And this is just a reminder that these ponds are not disconnected from the ocean. All of these ponds that we have in our neighborhoods, they eventually make their way to streams, ditches, and canals, which make their way to the ocean. So what we do with ponds affects the natural waterways as well. So this is what a detention pond might look like out in the world. This is a dry detention pond, so there's no water in it now, but in a heavy rain this would fill up with water. This pond is mowed, and this is how most of them look, but it would actually filter a lot better if we allowed wetland plants to grow in it. Here's an alternate picture of another dry detention pond, and this one has been, they've refrained from mowing in and around the edges.
Just let it grow.
Yeah, they just let it grow, and this one has a lot more filter plants in it, and this is a lot more capable of removing nutrient pollution from the water. Here's an example of a wet detention pond, and this is how most of them look. They're mowed right to the edge, and they're treated with chemicals that kill the plants that live inside them, so they don't have much chance to remove the nutrients. Basically, all the nutrients are just steeping around in the pond, waiting for it to flood over into the ocean and pollute the ocean with excess nutrients. But here's an example of a much nicer pond on a university campus where plants have been allowed to grow lushly towards the center and around the edge. And this pond is much more capable of removing nutrients from the water and preventing pollution problems. And in my opinion, this is also nicer to look at. But I think a lot of us sort of need to adjust our aesthetic expectations towards having a system that looks more like a natural wetland than a swimming pool. So that's part of the problem, is that our expectations for how these ponds should look, that they should have short mowed grass all the way to the edge and no weeds in the pond, can be very destructive because they lead us to poison the plants in and around the ponds, and oftentimes that leads to death of the animals in the ponds. This is from a lake in South Naples where there was a massive fish kill with thousands of dead fish, and this white layer is the white bellies of fish that are floating dead belly up and have drifted against the side of this pond here. And this happened after the weeds in this pond were killed. All those rotting weeds led to oxygen depletion, and the chemicals that were used to kill the weeds are toxic not only to weeds but to some of the wildlife as well. So you're not just killing the plants, you're also in serious danger of killing the animals in your pond when you treat for the weeds in the pond. Another one of the problems of this aesthetic first management where you get rid of all the plants is that without the plants, there's no plants to absorb nutrients from the water, and fast growing nuisance algae will grow and cause problems in the pond. So you're just creating a worse problem for the future.
So the algae compensates for the plants that were once there.
Right. If the plants don't suck up the nutrients, the algae are going to suck up the nutrients, and algae grow faster than plants. So what we can end up getting locked into is sort of a algae grows, poison the algae grows again, poison the algae cycle, which is really good if you're the person who is getting paid to come out and poison every week.
Exactly.
But it's really bad for the residents and the environment and the fish. In the news, this fish die-off was blamed on the heat, but I really think that it's an interaction of the sudden poisoning and rotting of all the plants in this lake, on top of the hot conditions. So I would say that this was misguided lake management that led to this problem and could have been avoided. This is what that lake looks like from overhead. It's of course an artificial lake, which is why it looks like this. And the color looks unnatural. In particular, this satellite lake of the system has this sort of strange blue color, which is related to the dyes and chemicals that they put in the lake, and those are not healthy for the environment.
What are those dyes? Okay, you're probably going into that. There you
so
go.
Here's another picture of one of these dyes. I'm calling this a Kool-Aid blue poison pond. Copper sulfate is one of the main chemicals that can give the lakes these colors. It's an algicide, so it's intended to kill algae, but it also kills plants and animals. So, particularly in high concentrations, it will kill everything. And so you're basically turning this thing, which is supposed to have plants in it to filter out the pollution, into just a blue pit of pollution, which then overflows into the ocean and causes algae blooms further on down the line. So this is unfortunately a trend in how many of our ponds are managed. This is real data from a lake management contractor regarding what chemicals they treated one particular pond with over the course of a year. So all these different shadings here are different types of chemical that are used to treat algae and weeds in the lake. And you can see that several times every month they would go out there and dump poison of several varieties, from glyphosate to diquat to hydrothol, into this pond. So it's not just one type of chemical, it's really a cocktail of poisons that are being used over and over again in this kind of addictive system where they poison it, but then the nutrients soar in abundance again, and the algae come in and you poison it again. And it would just make much more sense to let plants grow and let the plants absorb the nutrients rather than trying to kill everything and having these both the chemical toxins and the potentially toxic algae in the pond. So here's two really good reasons to stop persecuting weeds. So I'm saying weeds, I mean these healthy water plants here. Okay, so water plants, they absorb nutrients, as I said earlier. Plants and algae compete for the same nutrients. The same nutrients that a plant uses are the nutrients that the algae would use. So if there's plants, the plants are sucking up the nutrients and getting them before the algae can get them, and that can prevent the algae from growing. The other reason is what we call consumer control. Algae are eaten by small animals like zooplankton, things like copepods and water fleas. They will eat the algae and keep the algae under control as long as they're alive. But some of the poisons that we use to kill the algae also kill the algae eaters and can make it really easy for the algae to come back. So another reason to manage our ponds in an organic way without using algicides or herbicides is to keep the natural algae eaters present. Another benefit that's not mentioned here is that the algae eaters will often live among the fronds of the plants. So there's a whole kind of synergy between the plants, which can control the algae, and the algae eaters, which can also control the algae. So a lot of times, if we don't know what to expect from the environment, we sort of have in mind some kind of idealized vision of what a pond or a lake should look like. And when we ask the landscapers, make it look nice, this is what they'll do for us, even if it means poisoning the pond. So what we need to do is ask for something different, something that's more natural and actually more helpful to the environment, which uses abundant plants to sequester nutrients from the water and naturally control algae blooms. All right, so that's a good spot to pause, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.